The obese girl raised her siblings alone after her parents gone. She touched Mountain Man's heart. The winter of 1825 came early to the Wyoming Territory, sweeping down from the mountains with a vengeance that turned the small frontier town of Bitter Creek into a place of frozen breath and crackling ice. Hannah Bell stood at the doorway of her small log cabin, watching the pre-dawn darkness begin to fade into gray. At 25 years old, her substantial frame filled the doorway completely, her round face marked by exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. Her hands, rough and calloused from endless labor, gripped the wooden frame as she steeled herself for another day. Behind her, in the single room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and parlor all at once, 3 small forms lay huddled beneath threadbare blankets. Samuel, 14, his lanky frame just beginning to show the promise of manhood. Margaret, 11, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. And little Thomas, barely 7, his thumb resting against his cheek, even in sleep. They were her world, her responsibility, her reason for drawing breath each morning. It had been 2 years since the accident. 2 years since the wagon carrying her parents had lost a wheel on the mountain pass, sending them tumbling down the rocky slope to their deaths. 2 years since Hannah had transformed from the eldest daughter into something else entirely: mother, father, provider, protector. The transformation had not been gentle, nor had the town made it easy. Hannah moved quietly through the cabin, her movements practiced and efficient despite her size. She had learned long ago that her body, which the townspeople found so easy to mock, was also capable of tremendous strength. She could haul water from the creek without stopping to rest. She could scrub floors for hours without straightening her back. She could carry Thomas on one hip and a basket of laundry on the other without breaking stride. Her body was not the delicate, willowy thing that the town deemed beautiful, but it was hers, and it was strong, and that was all that mattered. The fire in the hearth had died to embers overnight. Hannah knelt before it, coaxing it back to life with practiced efficiency. The kindling caught quickly, and soon flames were licking at the larger pieces of wood she fed into the hungry mouth of the fireplace. She filled the iron pot with water from the bucket she had hauled in the night before and set it over the fire to boil. Oats were scarce, but she had enough for a thin porridge. If she made it watery enough, there would be sufficient for all 4 of them, and perhaps a bit left over for the evening meal. As the water began to heat, Hannah pulled on her heavy woolen coat, patched in a dozen places, the patches themselves now wearing thin, and wrapped a shawl around her head. The chickens needed tending, and there were eggs to collect if they were lucky. Every egg meant a few pennies at the market, and pennies accumulated into the dollars they needed for flour, salt, and the occasional piece of salt pork. The cold outside struck her like a physical blow. Her breath formed white clouds in the air as she made her way to the small chicken coop her father had built in better times. 3 scrawny hens huddled together on their roosts, their feathers fluffed against the cold. Hannah spoke to them softly as she always did, her voice gentle despite her exhaustion. "Mornin', ladies. Cold one today, isn't it? Let's see what you got for me." 2 eggs. It was fewer than she had hoped for, but she had learned not to expect much from a world that gave so little. She tucked them carefully into her pockets and refreshed the hen's water, breaking the thin sheet of ice that had formed overnight. By the time she returned to the cabin, the children were stirring, Samuel sat up first, his eyes still heavy with sleep, but his expression alert. He had grown up fast in the past 2 years, too fast. Hannah sometimes caught him looking at her with an expression that mixed gratitude with guilt, as if he blamed himself for being another mouth to feed rather than a help. "Stay in bed a bit longer," Hannah told him, keeping her voice low so as not to wake the younger ones. "It's bitter cold this morning." But Samuel was already pulling on his boots, his thin shoulders set with determination. "I can chop more wood before school, and I heard Mr. Patterson at the general store might need help unloading a shipment today." Hannah felt her heart squeeze. 14 years old and already shouldering burdens that should have been a man's. "You focus on your schooling," she said firmly. "That's your job." Hannah. No arguments. Her tone left no room for discussion, but she softened it with a slight smile. "Besides, I need you to walk Margaret and Thomas to school. You know how Thomas dawdles." Samuel nodded, accepting this compromise. He understood, even if he did not like it, that Hannah needed to believe she could still protect them from the harshest realities of their situation. The morning routine unfolded with the precision of long practice. Porridge was spooned into wooden bowls, each portion carefully measured. Margaret helped Thomas dress, buttoning his shirt with patient fingers while he wiggled and complained about the cold. Hannah packed their lunch 3 pieces of bread, thin slices of cheese she had bartered for by taking in Mrs. Henderson's washing, and an apple cut into quarters. As they prepared to leave, Hannah knelt before Thomas, adjusting his scarf and hat. His round face, so like their mother's, looked up at her with complete trust. "Be good for Miss Carter," she told him, pressing a kiss to his forehead, "and walk straight home after school. No stopping to look at the horses at the livery." "But Hannah, Mr. Morrison said I could pet the new mare." "Straight home," she repeated, but her eyes were warm. "Maybe on Saturday we can visit the horses together." After they left, the cabin felt cavernously empty. Hannah allowed herself one moment, just one, to sink onto the wooden bench by the table and close her eyes. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on her like a physical thing, and for just that moment she let herself feel it fully. Then she stood, squared her shoulders, and set about the business of survival. Her first job of the day was at the boarding house on Main Street, where Mrs. Walsh needed help with the washing. Hannah had become expert at washing. Her strong arms could scrub and wring without tiring, and she had developed an efficient system for heating water, soaking, scrubbing, rinsing, and hanging. Mrs. Walsh paid poorly, but she paid reliably, and in Bitter Creek, reliability was worth more than generosity. The walk to Main Street took her past the other cabins and buildings of the small town. Bitter Creek was hardly more than a collection of rough structures clustered along a single muddy street, but it represented civilization in a territory that was still largely wilderness. To the north, the mountains rose like a wall, their peaks white with snow even in summer. To the south, the plains stretched endlessly, broken only by occasional stands of cottonwood along the creek beds. Hannah kept her eyes down as she walked, knowing from experience that meeting the gazes of the townspeople often led to discomfort. She heard the whispers, of course. She always heard them. "Look at her, poor thing, big as a barn. Raising those children all alone, it's not proper. Someone should step in. A woman like that, with no husband, no prospects, who would have her? She's enormous. The words had stung once, each comment a small knife slipped between her ribs. But Hannah had developed calluses on her heart, just as she had on her hands. She had learned to transform that pain into fuel, burning it to keep moving forward. They could say what they wanted. Her siblings had full bellies mostly and a roof over their heads. That was what mattered. Mrs. Walsh's boarding house smelled of lye soap and boiled cabbage. The older woman met Hannah at the back door, her expression businesslike. "4 loads today," she said without preamble. "The miners came through yesterday, and you know how they are. Everything's filthy." Hannah nodded and set to work. The water had to be heated in the large cauldron over the fire, bucket by bucket hauled from the pump in the yard. Her back ached before she even began the actual washing, but she moved steadily, methodically. Scrub, wring, rinse, wring again. Her hands turned red and raw in the cold water, but she did not slow down. It was nearly midday when she finished. Mrs. Walsh inspected the work with a critical eye before nodding approval and pressing a few coins into Hannah's damp hand. "Same time next week?" she said, already turning away. Hannah pocketed the coins barely enough for a week's worth of flour and headed to her next job. Mr. Chen at the general store needed help organizing the stockroom, and after that there was mending for Mrs. Patterson. And then the list went on. It always went on. By the time Hannah made her way home in the late afternoon, the sun was already sinking toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Her entire body ached with a deep, bone-level exhaustion. But as she approached the cabin, she saw smoke rising from the chimney and knew that Samuel had started the fire. The sight lifted her spirits more than she could express. Inside, the cabin was warm. Margaret had started supper more porridge, this time with a bit of dried meat stirred in for flavor. Thomas sat at the table practicing his letters on a precious piece of slate, his tongue poking out in concentration. Samuel was mending his own boots, his young face serious with focus. "How was school?" Hannah asked, hanging up her coat and unwrapping her shawl. "Miss Carter says I'm the best reader in class," Margaret announced proudly. "She lent me a book to take home, Robinson Crusoe. Can we read it together tonight?" Hannah smiled, even though exhaustion pulled at her like an anchor. "Of course we can, after supper and chores." That night, after the dishes were washed and put away, after Thomas had been tucked into bed with his story, after Samuel and Margaret had completed their schoolwork, Hannah sat by the fire with the borrowed book in her lap. Margaret leaned against her side, warm and solid, while Samuel sat nearby, mending a shirt. Hannah read aloud, her voice soft in the quiet cabin, and for a little while they could forget the cold and the poverty and the endless struggle. For a little while they were just a family, bound together by love and stories and the warmth of the fire. Luke McGraw had not intended to spend the winter in Bitter Creek. The mountain man had planned to trap through the cold months in the high country as he had done for the past 15 years. But a bad fall from his horse had left him with cracked ribs that made the solitary life of the trapline impossible. So he had descended from the mountains to the small frontier town, renting a room above the saloon and taking odd jobs while he healed. The townspeople regarded him with a mixture of fear and fascination. At 38, Luke was weathered by years of mountain living. His dark beard, streaked with gray, hung to his chest. His eyes, pale blue like winter ice, seemed to see through pretense and lies. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders draped in furs and buckskin. Children scattered when he walked down the street, and even grown men gave him a wide berth. Luke preferred it that way. He had come to the mountains originally to escape the company of men, and though necessity had forced him back to civilization temporarily, he had no desire for social entanglements. He did his work, earned his pay, and spoke only when necessary. It was on a gray afternoon in late November that Luke first encountered Hannah Bell. He had gone to the general store to purchase supplies, coffee, gunpowder, flour, and Mr. Patterson had mentioned that he could get fresh eggs and goat's milk from the Bell girl's little stand set up in front of her cabin at the edge of town. Luke found the place easily enough. The cabin was small and weathered, but well maintained. Someone had recently patched the roof, and the stone chimney showed signs of recent repair. A simple wooden table stood near the door, and on it sat a basket of eggs and 2 jars of milk, covered with clean cloth. Luke was examining the eggs when the door opened and a large young woman emerged. She wore a simple dress covered by a worn apron, and her round face showed surprise at finding a customer. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't hear you approach. The eggs are 2 cents each, and the milk is 5 cents a jar." Luke studied her for a moment. He had heard the town's gossip about the Bell girl, the fat sister trying to raise her siblings alone, the object of pity and mockery in equal measure. But the woman before him showed neither the defeat he expected nor the desperation the gossips implied. Her eyes were clear and direct, and she held herself with quiet dignity despite her obvious poverty. "I'll take 6 eggs in both jars," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He placed the coins on the table, adding an extra nickel. Hannah looked at the money, then back at him. "That's too much." "Quality goods deserve fair payment." She hesitated, then carefully took only the correct amount, leaving his extra nickel on the table. "Thank you for your custom, Mr. McGraw, Luke McGraw." Recognition flickered in her eyes. The mountain man. It was not a question. "So they say." An awkward silence fell between them. Luke gathered his purchases, preparing to leave, but something made him pause. Through the open door of the cabin, he could see 3 children inside. A teenage boy sat at the table, helping a younger boy with his letters. A girl, perhaps 11 or 12, stirred something over the fire. The cabin was sparse but clean, and despite the obvious poverty, there was something warm about the scene that pulled at something long dormant in Luke's chest. "Your siblings?" he asked. Hannah's expression immediately became guarded. "Yes. Is there something else you need, Mr. McGraw?" He shook his head and turned to go, but as he walked away, he found himself thinking about the scene he had witnessed. There was something about the way the older boy had been patiently teaching the younger one, the way the girl had moved with confident competence around the fire, the way their sister had stood in the doorway with such fierce protectiveness. It reminded him of something he had lost long ago before he fled to the mountains to escape his memories. That night, Luke sat in his rented room above the saloon, listening to the sounds of drinking and laughter below. His ribs ached with the cold, and his thoughts kept returning to the cabin at the edge of town. He told himself it was none of his business. He had learned long ago that attachment brought only pain. Better to keep to himself, heal, and return to the mountains where he belonged. But the next day found him at the cabin again, this time with a sack of flour, some dried meat, and a jar of warm milk fresh from the general store. Hannah answered his knock with surprise evident on her face. "Mr. McGraw?" He held out the supplies, his expression impassive. "For the children." She looked at the food, then at him, and Luke saw a complex swirl of emotions cross her face: pride, gratitude, suspicion, hope. "I can't accept charity," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "It's not charity." Luke searched for words, unused to explaining himself. "It's payment." "Payment for what? I haven't done anything for you." Luke looked past her into the cabin where the three children had paused in their activities to stare at the stranger at their door. "You're doing the hardest work in the world," he said quietly, "raising three children alone, keeping them fed and safe and together. That kind of strength deserves support, not charity." Hannah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. "I don't need pity." "Good, because I don't pity you." Luke met her gaze steadily. "I respect you. There's a difference." For a long moment they stood there in the doorway, the cold wind whipping around them. Then Hannah slowly reached out and took the supplies. "Thank you," she whispered. Luke nodded once and turned to go, but Hannah's voice stopped him. "Mr. McGraw, would you like to stay for supper? It's not much, just stew, but you're welcome if you'd like." He should have said no. Every instinct told him to maintain his distance, to refuse this small offer of connection. But instead, he found himself nodding. That would be acceptable. The meal was simple, but good. Hannah had made a stew from dried beans and a bit of salt pork. Thickened with flour and seasoned with herbs she had dried herself. The children were initially shy around the imposing mountain man, but Luke's quiet manner gradually put them at ease. He asked Samuel about his schooling, listened to Thomas chatter about his teacher, and complimented Margaret on the biscuits she had made. As the evening wore on, Luke found himself talking more than he had in months. He told them about the mountains, about tracking elk through fresh snow, about the vast silence of the high country. The children listened with wide eyes, and even Hannah seemed to relax, her earlier wariness fading. When it was time to leave, Luke stood in the doorway, suddenly reluctant to return to his cold room above the saloon. "Thank you for the meal," he said. "It was the best I've had in a long time." Hannah smiled, and Luke was struck by how it transformed her face, chasing away the exhaustion and worry. "Thank you for the food, Mr. McGraw, and for the company. We don't get many visitors." "I imagine not." He hesitated, then added, "I noticed your fence is sagging in the back. I could fix it if you like, in exchange for more of those eggs." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to, but I'd like to, if you'll let me." Hannah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Thank you." As Luke walked back through the dark streets toward the saloon, he tried to tell himself that he was simply being practical. The cabin needed repairs that Hannah clearly couldn't afford to hire done, and he had time while his ribs healed. It was a simple exchange, nothing more. But deep down, in a place he had thought long frozen, something had begun to thaw. Over the following weeks, Luke became a regular presence at the Bell cabin. True to his word, he repaired the sagging fence, replacing rotted posts and reinforcing weak sections. He fixed the loose stones in the chimney that had been letting smoke seep into the cabin. He shored up the hen house against predators and showed Samuel how to set snares for rabbits to supplement their meager diet. The townspeople noticed, of course. Bitter Creek was too small for anything to go unnoticed. The gossip spread like wildfire through the small community. "Have you seen? The mountain man is courting the Bell girl." "Courting? Don't be ridiculous. He probably feels sorry for her." What could a man like that possibly see in someone like her? It's unnatural, that's what it is. A giant bear of a man and that fat girl. Luke heard the whispers, saw the looks, and ignored them completely. He had never cared what small-minded people thought of him, and he wasn't about to start now. Hannah, for her part, seemed to have developed the same skill. She moved through the town with her head high, doing her work and caring for her siblings with the same quiet determination she had always shown. As winter deepened, Luke found himself spending more time at the cabin. He told himself it was practical the children needed wood split, and Hannah needed help hauling water when the creek began to freeze. But the truth, which he was slowly admitting to himself, was that he simply wanted to be there. The cabin, with its cramped quarters and threadbare furnishings, felt more like home than anywhere he had been in 15 years. He taught Samuel to shoot, using an old rifle that had belonged to the boy's father. The teenage boy had a natural aptitude for marksmanship, and Luke felt an unexpected swell of pride when Samuel brought down his first rabbit. He showed Margaret how to identify animal tracks in the snow, explaining the difference between deer and elk, between coyote and wolf. And Thomas, the youngest, followed Luke around like a devoted puppy, peppering him with endless questions about the mountains and the animals that lived there. With Hannah, the relationship was different, more complicated. Luke found himself noticing small things about her, the way she hummed while she worked, the fierce protectiveness that flashed in her eyes when anyone threatened her siblings, the rare smile that appeared when she thought no one was watching. She was unlike any woman he had ever known. There was no artifice to her, no coy manipulation or false modesty. She was simply herself, honest and strong and real. One evening in early December, after the children had gone to bed, Luke and Hannah sat by the fire, enjoying a rare moment of quiet. Hannah was mending a shirt, her needle moving with practiced efficiency, while Luke sharpened his hunting knife on a whetstone. "Can I ask you something?" Hannah said, breaking the comfortable silence. "You can ask." "Why are you here? I mean really here, not just fixing things or helping with chores, but why?" Luke considered the question, his hand stilling on the knife. It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. "Do you know why I went to the mountains?" he asked finally. Hannah shook her head. "I had a family once, a wife and a daughter, Sarah and Emily. They died of fever 12 years ago back in Missouri. I couldn't stay in that house, in that town, with all those memories. So I ran. I went as far from civilization as I could get, buried myself in the mountains where I didn't have to feel anything." Hannah's hands had stilled on her mending. "I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago." Luke resumed sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the silence. "But up there in the mountains, alone with nothing but the wind and the snow, you start to realize that running from pain doesn't make it disappear. It just makes you hollow. And then I came down here, and I saw you with your siblings, and I saw—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I saw someone who didn't run from the hard things, someone who faced them head on, who carried the weight without complaint, and I realized that's what real strength looks like." Hannah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm not strong, Mr. McGraw. Most days I feel like I'm barely holding on." "That's exactly what makes you strong." Luke looked at her directly, his pale eyes intense. "Strength isn't never feeling tired or scared. It's keeping going even when you are." They sat in silence for a while longer, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind outside. Finally, Hannah spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you really come back today? After you fixed the fence, you could have stayed away." Luke set down his knife and whetstone. "Because, for the first time in 12 years, I didn't feel hollow, and I wasn't ready to give that up yet." Hannah looked up at him, and something passed between them, an understanding, an acknowledgment of something neither was quite ready to name. "I'm glad you came back," she said softly. "So am I." The winter of 1825 to 1826 was harsh, even by Wyoming Territory standards. Snow fell in heavy blankets, and temperatures plummeted until the creek froze solid and frost formed intricate patterns on the inside of the cabin windows. But inside the Bell cabin, there was warmth. Luke spent most of his days there now, having given up his room at the saloon. He told himself, and anyone who asked, that it made practical sense he could help keep the fire going, hunt for fresh meat, and ensure the children were safe. But the truth was simpler and more profound. He wanted to be there. For the first time since losing his family, he wanted to be part of something larger than himself. He and Hannah fell into an easy rhythm. Luke would rise before dawn to tend the fire and feed the animals. Hannah would prepare breakfast while he went hunting, often returning with a rabbit or, on lucky days, a small deer. Samuel helped with the heavier chores, growing stronger and more capable by the day. Margaret learned to cook from Hannah, her natural aptitude blossoming under her sister's patient instruction. And Thomas, bright and curious, soaked up everything like a sponge. The townspeople continued to gossip, but now there was a different tone to their whispers. Some remained disapproving, but others began to see the arrangement with grudging respect. Mrs. Henderson, the widow who had occasionally given Hannah washing work, began sending over extra food for the children. Mr. Patterson at the general store sometimes forgot to add items to Hannah's bill. Even Mrs. Walsh at the boarding house began paying Hannah slightly more for her washing services. It was not universal acceptance, but it was something. And for Hannah, who had endured years of mockery and pity, it was enough. On a particularly cold evening in January, Luke taught the children to play checkers using stones and a board he had carved from a piece of scrap wood. Thomas lost every game, but insisted on playing just one more time, until Hannah finally declared bedtime. As she tucked him in, the little boy looked up at her with sleepy eyes. "Hannah, is Mr. Luke going to be our papa now?" Hannah felt her heart skip. "Why would you ask that, Thomas?" "Because he's here all the time, and he takes care of us like Papa used to, and you smile more when he's around." From the mouth of children comes truth. Hannah smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "Mr. Luke is our friend. He's helping us, that's all." "But don't you want him to stay forever?" Did she? The question kept Hannah awake long after the children were asleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to their steady breathing, and forced herself to confront the truth she had been avoiding. She had fallen in love with Luke McGraw. Slowly, quietly, without dramatic declarations or grand gestures, love had crept into her heart and taken root. But what future could there be for them? Luke was a mountain man, wild and untethered. She was a poor woman with 3 children to raise and a body that the world deemed unworthy of love. Even if he cared for her, and sometimes she thought she saw something tender in his eyes when he looked at her, how could she ask him to give up his freedom? How could she saddle him with her responsibilities? The next morning, Hannah was quieter than usual. Luke noticed immediately. "Are you well?" he asked as they stood at the stove together preparing breakfast. "Just tired," she said, not meeting his eyes. Luke studied her for a moment, then nodded. He did not push, but throughout the day she felt him watching her with a concerned expression. That evening, after the children were in bed, Luke broke the silence. "Hannah, we need to talk." Her heart sank. This was it he was leaving. She had known it would happen eventually. Men like Luke McGraw were not meant to be tied down by domestic responsibilities. "I understand," she said quickly. "You've done so much for us already. You don't owe us anything more." Luke looked confused. "What are you talking about?" "You're leaving, going back to the mountains. Is that what you think?" Luke shook his head. "Hannah, I'm not going anywhere, not unless you want me to." "But I thought—" "I know what you thought." Luke moved closer, his expression serious. "And that's why we need to talk. About what this is. About what we're doing here." Hannah's hands twisted in her apron. "I don't understand." "Don't you?" Luke's voice was gentle. "Hannah, these past months they've been the best months I've had in 12 years. Being here with you and the children, being part of something again, it's brought me back to life. And I need to know if you feel even a fraction of what I feel." Hannah stared at him, her mind reeling. "What do you feel?" Luke reached out and took her hands in his. His palms were rough and warm, calloused from years of hard living. "I love you, Hannah Bell. I love your strength and your courage. I love how you put your siblings first, always. I love how you face each day with determination, even when you're exhausted. I love your kindness and your quiet dignity. And I love how you made me feel like I'm not just surviving anymore, but actually living." Tears streamed down Hannah's face. "But I'm not beautiful. I'm not the kind of woman that men want." "You're exactly the kind of woman I want." Luke's voice was fierce. "Do you hear me? I don't care what those small-minded people in town say. I don't care that you're not some delicate china doll. You're real and strong and beautiful, and I would be honored if you would let me stay. Not as a helper or a friend, but as your husband, if you'll have me." Hannah could hardly breathe. "You want to marry me?" "I want to marry you. I want to help you raise these children. I want to build a life with you, a real life. I know I'm not much, just a rough mountain man with more experience with elk than with people, but I promise I will work every day to be worthy of you." "Worthy of me?" Hannah laughed through her tears. "Luke, you're the one who's too good for this. You could have anyone. Why would you choose me?" Luke cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Because you're the only one I want. The only one I've ever wanted since the day I saw you. So what do you say, Hannah Bell? Will you marry me?" Hannah looked into his pale blue eyes and saw nothing but truth and love shining back at her. For years, she had believed herself unworthy of such things. She had accepted the world's judgment that someone like her did not deserve happiness or love or partnership. But looking at Luke, feeling the warmth of his hands on her face, she realized that the world had been wrong. "Yes," she whispered, "yes, I'll marry you." Luke smiled a rare, brilliant smile that transformed his weathered face, and then he kissed her, gentle and reverent, as if she were something precious and fragile. And for the first time in her life, Hannah felt truly beautiful. They were married in February in a simple ceremony at the small church in Bitter Creek. Reverend Matthews performed the service with Margaret, Samuel, and Thomas standing as witnesses. Hannah wore a dress that Mrs. Henderson had altered from one of her own gowns, and Luke wore clean buckskins and had trimmed his beard for the occasion. The townspeople came, some out of genuine goodwill, others out of curiosity. But Hannah found that she no longer cared about their opinions. Standing beside Luke, holding his strong hand in hers, she felt invincible. After the ceremony, they held a small celebration at the cabin. Mrs. Henderson brought a cake she had baked. Mr. Chen, from the general store, contributed a crock of butter. Even Mrs. Walsh, who had never been particularly warm, arrived with a jar of preserves and a grudging smile. That night, after the guests had left and the children were asleep, Hannah and Luke sat together by the fire as husband and wife. "Thank you," Hannah said softly. "For what?" "For seeing me. Really seeing me, not just what everyone else sees." Luke pulled her close, and she rested her head on his broad shoulder. "Thank you for letting me see you," he replied, "and for giving me a reason to come down from the mountain." As winter gave way to spring, life in the cabin transformed. Luke's hunting skills meant they had meat regularly. His knowledge of the wilderness allowed him to supplement their income by guiding hunting parties and selling furs. Hannah continued her washing and mending work, but with Luke's contribution, the financial pressure eased considerably. In March, Luke made an announcement. "I've been thinking," he said one evening, "this cabin is too small for 5 people, and come next winter, it might be 6. Hannah blushed, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. She had only recently realized she was pregnant, and they had not yet told the children. "I want to build us a proper house," Luke continued, "up on the North Ridge, where there's good land for farming and hunting, close enough to town that the children can still go to school, but far enough that we have space to grow." A house? Hannah could hardly imagine such luxury, but that would cost. "I have money saved, 15 years of trapping, and I spent almost nothing. It's just been sitting in an account in St. Louis. Might as well use it for something good." And so, as the snow melted and the first wildflowers appeared in the meadows, Luke began building their new home. Samuel worked alongside him, learning carpentry and masonry. The house grew slowly but steadily, a sturdy log structure with 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a parlor with a stone fireplace. The townspeople watched with interest as the house took shape. Some helped, offering materials or labor. Mr. Patterson donated window glass. Mrs. Henderson sewed curtains. Even the school teacher, Miss Carter, helped paint the interior walls. By summer, the house was complete. It was not grand or fancy, but it was solid and warm and theirs. Hannah walked through the rooms, touching the smooth wood walls, marveling at the glass windows, and feeling tears of joy stream down her face. "Do you like it?" Luke asked, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Like it? Luke, it's perfect. It's more than I ever dreamed of." They moved in on a warm day in June. The children raced through the house, claiming bedrooms and exploring every corner. Hannah stood in her new kitchen, with its proper shelves and work table, and felt as though she had stepped into a dream. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Luke took Hannah's hand. "I've been thinking about names," he said. "For the baby? If it's a girl, I'd like to call her Emily after my daughter, if that's all right with you." Hannah squeezed his hand. "I think that's beautiful. And if it's a boy? What about William, after your father? William McGraw." Hannah smiled. "I like the sound of that."